In the middle of Manhattan's most exclusive gala, a black woman lifted her phone, and in just 9 words, she shattered a $1.2 billion deal and the family's entire legacy. The crystal chandeliers of the Meridian Club threw their fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor, each gleam catching on the shoes and jewelry of Manhattan's most powerful. Champagne flutes chimed softly in manicured hands, the laughter of old money rolling through the penthouse in easy, practiced waves. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided between clusters of guests, carrying trays of oysters and caviar. The air was warm with perfume, cigar smoke, and the unshakable confidence of people who believed they owned the city. Dr. Kesha Washington had just stepped away from the balcony view when the voice cut through the room. "I'm sure the kitchen is downstairs, dear." It was Victoria Whitmore, draped in emerald silk. Her tone a perfect blend of condescension and amusement. She looked Kesha up and down as though she were appraising a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. Before Kesha could answer, another voice slid in, smooth as glass and twice as cold. "The help should know their place," Catherine Whitmore said, leaning on her pearl-handled cane, her smile brittle and perfect. A few heads turned at the comment, some smirking, others pretending they hadn't heard. Across the room, Marcus Whitmore Jr. had already pulled out his phone. The glow lit his face as he angled the camera toward them, grinning. "Watch this," he murmured, tagging a friend before hitting record. The background hum of conversation continued, but within this small circle, the temperature seemed to drop. One of the club's security men began moving toward them, earpiece glinting under the chandeliers. The second followed, eyes scanning Kesha with the practiced detachment of someone accustomed to deciding who belonged and who didn't. "Ma'am," the taller one said as he closed the distance. "I'll need to check." He reached forward, fingers sliding toward the small black clutch in her hand. But before he could touch it, Kesha's own hand came up, stopping his wrist mid-motion. The movement was calm, unhurried, but her grip was firm. Her eyes met his with a level, unblinking stare that froze him in place. For a moment, the only sound was the soft piano drifting from the corner of the room. The waiter passing behind them hesitated, sensing something about this interaction wasn't the usual social friction. Marcus Jr.'s camera caught the pause, the momentary shift in the guard's posture, the way Kesha's calm seemed heavier than anyone else's anger. She didn't raise her voice, didn't even break the faint line of a polite smile. But in that stillness, there was something that made the guard step back half a pace without thinking. Around them, the conversation picked up again, the Whitmore's friends pretending to be only half interested while their eyes stayed fixed on the scene. The air carried that sharp, metallic scent that comes when tension cuts through luxury. Somewhere near the bar, a guest whispered to another, the words too soft to catch, but the glance in Kesha's direction said everything. The Whitmores weren't used to pushback, certainly not here, certainly not from someone they decided didn't belong. Victoria tilted her head, pearls swaying against her collarbone, waiting for Kesha to break, to apologize, to step back into whatever box they thought she came from. But Kesha didn't move. Her hand released the guard's wrist with the same measured precision with which it had stopped him, as if granting permission for the moment to pass. She adjusted the clutch, eyes steady, voice still silent. In that silence was an edge, the kind that suggested this was not the first time she'd been tested, and not the first time she'd walked away on her own terms. The music from the piano drifted back into the foreground, but for those standing close, it couldn't mask the feeling that something had shifted. Victoria's smile tightened, Catherine's eyes narrowed. Marcus Jr. kept filming, oblivious to the fact that the footage in his hands might someday be remembered for all the wrong reasons. And Kesha simply stood there, perfectly still, like someone who knew that time was on her side. In the gleam of the marble and the glow of the chandeliers, she looked less like an outsider than the only person in the room who understood exactly how the night was going to end. The Whitmore family closed in with the slow, deliberate movements of people who knew their presence alone could corner someone. Victoria shifted to Kesha's right, Catherine to her left, James Whitmore Sr. stepping in just enough to block the open space behind her. Together they formed a half-circle, a wall of silk, pearls, and tailored suits, cutting her off from the rest of the room. Around them, the flow of the gala slowed, guests pretending to continue their conversations while stealing glances over champagne rims. The crystal chandeliers threw sharp beams across their faces, catching the faint glint of judgment in their eyes. The taller security guard stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your invitation." His partner hovered just behind him, one hand near his radio. Catherine's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes," she said, her tone carrying to the circle of onlookers. "Let's make sure it's legitimate. These days, you never know what might be duplicated." James S.R. gave a small, knowing nod as if she'd said something profound, his cufflinks flashing in the chandelier light. Kesha reached into her clutch without hurry, her fingers precise, her eyes steady. The cream-colored card slid between her fingers and into the guard's hand. He examined it under the light, his brow furrowing slightly. "It appears to be legitimate," he said, but before the words could land, Catherine's laugh cut through. "Appears," she repeated, savoring the word. "James, didn't the club update their security protocols this year?" James S.R. adjusted his bow tie, his voice carrying a quiet authority that years in boardrooms had sharpened. "Sometimes invitations are misplaced or photocopied." The implication hung in the air like a bad smell. From somewhere in the crowd, Marcus Jr.'s voice rang out, louder than necessary. "Not charity night, folks, we have standards." Laughter flickered at the edges of the gathering, the kind that wasn't about humor but about siding with power. As Kesha adjusted her clutch back into place, something slipped from between her fingers and fell to the marble floor. It landed with a soft, distinct sound that drew the guard's eye. He bent to pick it up and turned it over in his hand. The embossed letters caught the light. "Washington Capital Management." He read it aloud, and for a brief moment, his voice stumbled on the last word. From near the edge of the gathering, David Kim, a Bloomberg reporter who had been checking messages on his phone, looked up sharply. His eyes locked on the card, recognition sparking like a match. Without hesitation, he pulled his laptop from his bag, fingers already flying over the keys. In his world, moments like this were currency. The name alone told him this was more than a social spat. Around them, the subtle hum of the gala shifted. Guests leaned closer, some tilting their phones to catch better footage. One woman, her phone held high, had her Instagram Live counter ticking upward 3 digits, then 4, her viewers spamming the comments faster than she could read. The glow from her screen reflected off the crystal overhead, the light bouncing in fractured patterns that seemed to dance on the marble floor. Kesha glanced at the guard, then at the card in his hand. "Will that be all?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged. He hesitated, glancing toward James S.R. for guidance. James gave the faintest shake of his head, a signal to press on. The tension thickened, the air itself seeming to weigh more. From the outside, it might have looked like a polite exchange, but to those standing close, it had the sharp scent of a trial, every move scrutinized, every word weighed. Victoria folded her arms, her eyes cold, as if she were the judge presiding over a verdict. Catherine glanced at the growing crowd, clearly enjoying the attention, certain this was just another moment in which the Whitmore name would prevail. None of them noticed that the audience was no longer just the people in the room. Live stream notifications were pinging phones across the city, hashtags were being typed into comment boxes, and clips of the exchange were already being sent to group chats with captions like, "Wait for it." The numbers on those little red counters climbed higher, the digital crowd swelling. And though no one here could see them, their collective gaze was already fixed on the woman in the black dress, standing her ground under the chandelier light. From somewhere near the stage, the MC's polished voice rolled over the crowd, clear enough to cut through the low hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are exactly 14 minutes away from revealing the Whitmore Foundation's strategic partner for our $1.2 billion initiative." The words hung in the air like the opening bell of a fight everyone had come to see. A ripple passed through the room, the kind of anticipatory shift that happens before the curtain lifts. Waiters moved with a bit more urgency, photographers adjusted their lenses, and the Whitmore family seemed to stand taller, their confidence buoyed by the promise of their biggest public triumph. Under the glittering chandeliers, Kesha's eyes drifted down to the understated steel watch on her wrist. She studied the second hand for a moment, then murmured just loud enough for the phone cameras nearby to catch, 13 minutes perfect. The words were barely more than a breath, but they carried a weight that made a few people glance at her twice. One of them was David Kim, who paused mid-keystroke at the phrase before returning to his laptop with renewed focus. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, and without breaking her composure, Kesha slipped it out and pressed it to her ear. "Yes, Marcus, hold that thought," she said, her voice low but distinct enough that those closest could hear the name. Her tone wasn't rushed, but there was a precision to it, the cadence of someone who knew exactly how much time she had and exactly what she intended to do with it. Around her, the temperature of the room shifted again. Guests who had been pretending to ignore the earlier confrontation were now stealing obvious glances. The ones holding their phones angled them higher, their lenses capturing not just the Whitmore's tight smiles, but Kesha's calm, deliberate movements. At one table near the back, a woman leaned toward her companion, whispering something that made both of them turn their phones horizontally. In the far corner, David Kim's fingers were moving faster, his eyes flicking between the laptop screen and the unfolding scene. He wasn't just taking notes anymore, he was building a narrative in real time. The words Marcus and 13 minutes were already highlighted in his draft. Across the room, a group of younger guests who had been quietly scrolling through Instagram began forwarding clips to friends with captions like, "Watch this live," and "This is about to get crazy." Notifications buzzed like cicadas in the summer heat, tiny vibrations in pockets and clutches that hinted at a much larger audience forming beyond these walls. Meanwhile, the Whitmores seemed oblivious to the shift. James SR was speaking with a donor, gesturing toward the stage with the pride of a man about to unveil his crowning achievement. Victoria stood beside him, her gaze drifting back to Kesha now and then, a small frown tightening at the corners of her mouth. Marcus Jr., still holding his phone, was watching his own livestream numbers climb, mistaking the growing viewership as validation of his mockery. The chandeliers threw sharp light across the marble, illuminating every expression, every subtle movement. The energy in the room had changed. It was no longer the easy confidence of a celebration, but something tighter, more electric. People began to position themselves for a better view, like spectators picking the best angle before the first blow lands. Kesha slipped her phone back into her clutch, her expression unchanged, but her eyes scanning the room like she was taking inventory. Every guest, every camera, every beam of light reflected in the marble seemed to register. Somewhere in that calculation, the countdown had already begun, and for those paying close enough attention, it was clear that whatever was coming would land before the MC's clock hit zero. Marble floor of the Meridian Club had seen a century of quiet deals and whispered betrayals, but tonight it would bear witness to something far louder. In the center of the penthouse, under the crystal glare of the chandeliers, Kesha Washington lifted her phone from her clutch and with a flick of her thumb tapped the speaker icon. The soft click of the setting carried in the sudden lull that had fallen over the room. Her voice came clear, steady, and final. "Marcus, execute the withdrawal." Yes, the entire partnership. The last three words seemed to stretch in the air, heavier with each syllable. For a breath, no one moved. The sound of the gala, the soft piano, the muted laughter, the clink of cutlery collapsed into absolute silence. And then it came, a single sharp crack as a champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble. The shards scattered like punctuation marks to a sentence no one wanted to read. Near the front of the half-circle, Victoria's manicured fingers tightened around her father's sleeve. "Daddy, what does that mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to betray the certainty she was trying to project. James Whitmore SR did not answer. His eyes were fixed on Kesha, searching her face for something, an opening, a hesitation, anything to suggest this was a bluff. But she offered nothing. Her expression was composed, the same unshaken calm she had worn all evening. Only now it seemed to hold the weight of inevitability. Across the room, David Kim's fingers were flying across his keyboard. The headline had already taken shape before the words were fully out of her mouth. "Partnership collapse mid-gala," he typed, hitting send before the Whitmores even registered the ripple moving through the crowd. Within seconds, the alert would ping phones in newsrooms across the city. Somewhere in the back, a guest mouthed the words she had just spoken to another, their eyes widening in disbelief. Those who had been laughing earlier now stood frozen, their expressions shifting from smug satisfaction to the wary, watchful look of people realizing they might be standing in the middle of a story no one would want to be on the wrong side of. Marcus Jr. lowered his phone an inch, the smirk fading from his face. He glanced at the screen, the numbers on his live stream still climbing, but the comments had changed. Where there had been mocking emojis and inside jokes minutes before, there were now bursts of capital letters and question marks, people demanding to know if they'd just heard what they thought they'd heard. The Whitmore family, for all their decades of control and calculated appearances, seemed suddenly untethered. The structure of the evening, the countdown, the speeches, the photo ops, had been built to funnel all attention toward their announcement. Now that funnel had been turned, its focus sharp and unrelenting on a single woman in a simple black dress, standing perfectly still in the center of the storm she had just unleashed. Kesha didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The marble and crystal carried every word without effort. "Thank you, Marcus," she said into the phone, as if confirming a dinner reservation instead of detonating a billion-dollar deal. I'll expect confirmation within the hour. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. Her movements precise, unhurried. The momentary vacuum her words had created began to fill, not with sound, but with a different kind of pressure. It pressed in from the edges of the room, the weight of dozens of eyes, the hum of speculation, the awareness that something irreversible had just happened. A guest near the bar let out a low whistle, the kind that carried equal parts disbelief and respect. Others exchanged quick, sharp whispers. The piano in the corner, still playing, sounded oddly disconnected from the moment, as though the soundtrack of the gala hadn't yet realized the scene had changed. Victoria's hand was still clamped on her father's arm, but now her nails were digging crescents into the fabric of his suit. James S.R.'s jaw tightened, his cufflinks catching the chandelier light as he adjusted them with a motion too controlled to be casual. Somewhere deep in his mind, calculations had begun, the mental math of damage control. But for the onlookers, for the hundreds of eyes in the room and the thousands more now watching through their screens, there was no mistaking what had just taken place. The Whitmore's grand unveiling had been stopped cold, shut down in front of their peers, their donors, and a rapidly multiplying online audience. Kesha had not just disrupted their evening, she had rewritten its ending. The first twist had landed, clean and devastating, and though no one yet understood the full scope of what it meant, the shift in the air was unmistakable. Those who had been so quick to dismiss her now felt the edge of something sharper than insult, a sense that whatever this was, it was only the beginning. For a moment, it seemed the shock of the cancelled partnership might hang unanswered, a rupture in the evening that no one knew how to mend. But Kesha wasn't finished. She reached into her clutch again, her movements measured and deliberate, and withdrew a single cream-colored envelope. The paper was heavy stock, the kind that spoke of boardrooms and private bankers, and in the top corner, the logo of Washington Capital Management stood out in embossed gold. She held it in one hand, letting the logo catch the chandelier light long enough for the nearest cameras to zoom in. Then, without raising her voice, she began. "Perhaps I should clarify my position, Mr. Whitmore," she said, eyes locked on James S.R. Washington Capital Management currently holds 34.7% of Whitmore Industries. A ripple moved through the crowd, the kind that starts as a murmur and swells into a wave. Catherine's hand flew to her pearls. Victoria blinked once, twice as if she hadn't heard correctly. Kesha continued, the precision in her tone making the numbers sound less like information and more like verdicts. Individually, James Whitmore Sr. holds 12.4%, Victoria Whitmore 8.7%, Marcus Whitmore Jr. 6.3%, Catherine Whitmore 3.8%, combined 31.2%, less than what I control. For a beat, the room was silent. And then from somewhere near the half-circle, Marcus Jr.'s voice broke through, low but clear enough for every microphone nearby. "She owns more than us combined." He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, just saying the thought out loud, but it landed like a confession. Phones tilted higher. The live stream counter on Marcus's own feed passed 120,000 viewers, the chat exploding with exclamation points, crown emojis, and the hashtag that was already climbing the trending charts, #WhitmoreRacist. David Kim's fingers flew over his keyboard, the second headline taking shape. Largest shareholder reveals stake in Whitmore Industries during Gala Confrontation. He didn't need to embellish. The numbers told the story. Kesha didn't glance at him or at the phones pointed her way. She kept her gaze steady on James S.R., her voice even. "As the largest single shareholder, I take the health and direction of this company very seriously. Tonight, your family has demonstrated values that are incompatible with the future I intend for Whitmore Industries." Gasps and half-suppressed murmurs rippled outward, the kind of sound that meant the audience was no longer neutral. Some were here for the spectacle, yes, but others were starting to lean in, not toward the Whitmores, but toward her. Every detail was calculated, from the way she let the embossed logo show just long enough for the livestream to capture it, to the cadence she used when reciting the percentages, giving each one its own sharp edge. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the guests clustered just beyond the half-circle. Catherine's knuckles whitened against her pearls. Marcus Jr. had stopped filming altogether, his phone hanging at his side as if he wasn't sure he wanted to document the rest. Somewhere behind them, a guest whispered, "This isn't a fight, this is a takeover." And they were right. The first twist had been enough to ruin their evening, but this second one cut deeper. The partnership was money, the shares were power. And in the world they lived in, power dictated everything else. Kesha let the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to settle over them. the reality that the company bearing their name was no longer under their control. In that space between words, the gala's purpose shifted entirely. This was no longer a celebration of the Whitmore legacy, it was the beginning of its dismantling, played out in real time before a live audience both in the room and online. When she finally lowered the envelope, slipping it back into her clutch, she did so with the calm finality of someone who knew that from this point forward, the balance of power had changed permanently. Kesha didn't raise her voice, but the marble and crystal of the penthouse carried every word as if she was speaking from a bench in a silent courtroom. She turned first to Catherine, repeating with perfect clarity the sentence that had left her lips earlier in the evening: the help should know their place. The repetition was stripped of pretense now, each syllable sharp as glass. Catherine's eyes flickered, her hand tightening on her pearls. Then to Victoria, "I'm sure the kitchen is downstairs, dear." The phrase landed heavier the second time, framed not as casual cruelty but as evidence. She moved to Marcus Jr., her gaze steady. "Not charity night, folks, we have standards." Around them, the room was so quiet that the sound of someone shifting their weight on the marble echoed like a door closing. "This," Kesha said, her eyes sweeping the semicircle of family, "is the conduct of the leadership of Whitmore Industries. Conduct witnessed by over 120,000 people in real time, and counting." Phones tilted higher. The live stream comments poured in faster than they could be read, the screen filled with crowns, fire emojis, and the word accountability repeated like a chant. "Effective immediately," she continued, "I am calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp." She let the time hang in the air for a moment before moving on. "We will be establishing a $50 million fund for minority-owned business partnerships. We will be reviewing and replacing senior leadership, and we will implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion reforms across every division of the company." The words were delivered without flourish, but they hit with the force of law. Victoria stepped forward, desperation cracking her voice. "But I'm CEO." Kesha didn't even let her finish. "You were CEO, now you're a case study." The interruption sliced through the room, leaving Victoria standing mute, her mouth half open, her confidence evaporating. A few guests exchanged glances, the sort of look people share when they've just seen the balance of power shift so completely there's no going back. James S.R. tried to rally, straightening his tie as if posture alone could reclaim authority. But Kesha's gaze fixed on him now, calm and unyielding. "Mr. Whitmore, as the largest shareholder, my recommendations carry not just weight, they carry votes. The board answers to me now." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The words seemed to close the space between them, leaving no room for argument. Beyond the marble and crystal walls, the city pulsed with its usual indifference, but inside the penthouse the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. This was no longer a gala, it was a reckoning. 2 years later, the name Whitmore Industries no longer carried the same associations it once had. The marble penthouse still stood, the chandeliers still caught the light. But the company that hosted its galas had transformed beyond recognition. Across 12 states, new community initiatives bore its logo: job fairs in underserved neighborhoods, scholarships for minority students, supply chain contracts awarded to small, diverse-owned businesses. ESG wasn't a line on a report anymore. It was visible in every handshake, every project ribbon cut. At a bustling business fair in Atlanta, Victoria Whitmore stood in a tailored suit that traded opulence for approachability. Cameras captured the moment she leaned forward to shake the hand of a black woman entrepreneur whose startup had just secured a major Whitmore Industries contract. The smile on Victoria's face was genuine, the kind that comes from doing something earned rather than inherited. A few booths away, a familiar voice carried over the crowd. Marcus Whitmore Jr., wearing a simple headset and surrounded by a small production crew, was recording an episode of his podcast Privilege Check. His audience now numbered in the millions, each week hearing him dissect systemic bias in corporate culture with the same candor that once made him an online villain. The comments flooding his live stream were no longer mocking. They were engaged, reflective, even grateful. Catherine Whitmore, pearl necklace still around her neck, but now symbolic of something else entirely, oversaw the Pearl Initiative from an office lined with photos of the women it had helped. 200 black women entrepreneurs received funding and mentorship each year under her leadership. The initiative's success rate stood at 94%, and its impact was measured not just in revenue, but in generational change. And then there was Kesha Washington. In the Grand Hall of the United Nations, In front of 500 business leaders from 40 countries, she stood at the podium, the steel watch on her wrist glinting in the floodlights. Her voice carried with the same calm authority it had in that penthouse 2 years ago. "Power isn't proven by what you own," she said, each word deliberate. "It's proven by what you choose to change." The applause began immediately and built into a sustained ovation, echoing against the marble walls. In the front row, Victoria, Marcus Jr., and Catherine sat side by side, not as figureheads clinging to legacy, but as leaders who had learned, reformed, and contributed to the change. The twist, for those who remembered the night of the gala, was that none of this had required a hostile takeover. Kesha had never seized control outright. She hadn't needed to. The threat had been enough. The clarity of her conditions, the weight of her ownership stake, and the spectacle of accountability had done the work. What followed was not destruction, but transformation. Whitmore Industries posted record growth 3 years running, not despite the reforms, but because of them. Employee satisfaction scores were at historic highs. Customer loyalty had deepened, and the company had become a model for inclusive corporate governance studied in business schools worldwide. Outside the UN building, a reporter asked Kesha if she considered that night her greatest victory. She paused, glanced toward the skyline, and said only, "It was never about winning. It was about making sure no one else lost the way so many have before." For those who heard it, the meaning was clear. The marble floor of the Meridian Club might still gleam with old money, but now it reflected something new, proof that power, when guided by integrity, could remake more than a company. It could reshape an entire legacy. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.